Aloha and welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio. I'm your host, Isla Allgood, on behalf of the Hawaii Writers Guild. And today we have one of our very special board members who's going to read for us today, Joy Fisher. And she'll be reading something that she's written, followed by some talk story where she and I will get to explore her life as a writer. So please join me in welcoming Joy.
Hi, Isla. Thanks a lot for having me on. I'm glad to be here today. I'm going to read the prologue from a book that I'm writing now. It's a memoir about the 9 years that I lived in Canada after I ran away from George Bush's America. And the prologue talks about the actual act of crossing the American-Canadian border in 2007. Crossing the border. On August 12th, 2007, 10 days after my 66th birthday, I left the land of my birth to become an exile in Canada. I had been planning for this day since November 3rd, 2004, the day after George W. Bush was elected President of the United States for the second time. After that election, a wry story about desperate US liberals sneaking across the Canadian border in the dead of night with nothing but a nice little bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet to sustain them circulated for a long time on the internet. Well-meaning friends who knew about my plan to leave had sent me copies of the story. I laughed the first time I received it, and I laughed just as hard the sixth. But I didn't follow the example of the protagonists in the story. I didn't sneak across the border in the dead of night. I am a careful person and a law-abiding one. So I bided my time and planned my move carefully. Finally, the day arrived. I'd stayed in Bellingham, Washington the night before, where I'd had dinner with an old friend who was living on nearby Lummi Island. Penelope and I had been friends since the 1960s, when we had both lived in Laguna Beach, California. We'd both been married to men then. Now, neither of us was. She had raised a daughter on her own. Now she was a sculptor, an independent woman living an artist's life. I hadn't had children, had come out as a lesbian during the years of what would later come to be called the second wave of the feminist movement, and had become a lawyer to make the world, or at least the United States, a better place for women. A lot had changed during the years since, some of it for the better, much of it, it seemed to me lately, for the worse, and not just for women. Penelope and I had drunk a toast to old friends and new beginnings and said our goodbyes. I'd turned in before the clock struck 12 so I could make the short drive to the border early the next morning. I had no idea how long it would take me to get across. And once I did get across, assuming all went well at the border, I had a long drive and ferry ride ahead of me before I got to the house I had rented in Victoria on Vancouver Island. In the morning, my two Siamese cats, Mary and Harrington, let me put them into their carriers without a struggle. I'd been afraid they would drive me crazy on the drive up. Harrington especially hated riding in cars and usually set up a yowl the minute he felt the car moving that lasted until the engine stopped. I'd gotten some kitty tranquilizers from the vet before I left, but I hadn't needed to use them once. It was as if they knew somehow something very special, very solemn was taking place, and they were on their best behavior. Well, kiddies, I said, as I lifted their cages onto the back seat of my Honda CRV, with a little luck, today's the day you become Canadian cats. We were off to meet our fate. When I pulled off the highway and into the northbound lane at the border crossing, I saw that, early though I was, the line ahead was long and moving slowly. Crossing into Canada used to be quick and informal. That had changed after 9/11. Now, at the insistence of the United States, security had been tightened at the border in both directions. It was going to be a long wait. I lowered my window, rested my elbow on the sill, and looked around. I was crossing at what's commonly called the Peace Arch border crossing between Blaine, Washington, and Surrey, British Columbia. The Peace Arch itself, an impressive white monument in the classical revival style, sits smack on the border between the two countries and commemorates the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which officially ended the War of 1812, the last war between the land that would become Canada and the United States. The inscription on the US side of the monument reads, "Children of a common mother." On the Canadian side, it reads, "Brethren dwelling together in unity." "What about the sistren?" I muttered, feminist reflexes jerking. But I knew there was nothing to worry about. Over the decades since 1921, when the Peace Arch had been dedicated, Canada had pulled light years ahead of the United States, both in its treatment of women and in the development of social programs for its citizens. Women's equality was unalterably embedded in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Same-sex marriage had been legal throughout Canada since 2005, and Canada had had universal health care since 1966. All of these factors had attracted me to Canada, as did the fact that English is spoken there. When it comes to languages, I admit I am the quintessential ugly American. I have studied 5 languages other than English during my life, and I speak none of them. This unfortunate characteristic came to light when I consulted a Canadian immigration lawyer. There is a saying in the legal profession that a lawyer who represents herself has a fool for a client. I'm not a fool. So when I began planning my exit strategy, I sought out a Canadian lawyer. I knew becoming a permanent resident of Canada would not be easy at my age. I'm not rich, so I couldn't make use of the many immigration programs that are available to people with money. The option that best fit me was the program for skilled workers. When I'd added up my points under that program, however, I discovered I was 5 points short of the total needed because at my age, I wasn't entitled to any of the points available for workers in the prime of their working lives. "No problem," my lawyer had said. "Just take the French test. You can get extra points for speaking French." I had to explain to him that while Canada may have 2 official languages, I do not. I told him my tale of woe about my last French test. I had studied French for 2 years in anticipation of doing an internship in a Belgian law firm in the early 1990s. When I arrived, one of the women partners invited me out to lunch. While we were dining, she'd said, "Now, I'm going to talk to you in French, and then I'm going to ask you what I said. And based on how well you understood me, I'll decide whether we'll address you in French or in English while you're working with us." So she spoke to me in French, and when she'd finished, I told her what I thought she'd said, After she'd heard me out, she said, "We'll talk to you in English." Clearly, I needed another strategy. So the Canadian lawyer and I explored my other options for gaining admission into Canada. I learned that if I were a full-time student for 2 years at a Canadian university, I would qualify for an additional 5 points, just enough to give me the total I needed to apply for permanent residency under the skilled worker program. That sounded good to me. I've always liked being a student. I would be retired, so I'd have time to go to school. Why not? It was settled. I would seek entry to Canada under a student permit, and then in 2 years, when I'd earned the points I needed, I would apply for permanent residency. Now, sitting in line, waiting to get up to the border guard, I started to get nervous. I had picked a school, the University of Victoria, and a major, Canadian Studies, and had a letter of admission from the school in the portfolio of documents I was carrying. But it was up to the border officials to decide whether to issue me the student permit. What if they took one look at my white hair, laughed in disbelief at the idea that a 66-year-old woman would come to Canada to go to university, and sent me packing back to the United States? What would I do then? I glanced nervously across the grass median at the line of cars moving slowly through US Customs heading south. What would I do if Canada wouldn't let me in? The car was packed with what I considered to be the bare essentials, including Marion Harrington. But the rest of my belongings were in the hands of a moving company and would be on the way to the border in a matter of days. I'd given up my apartment in Sacramento, California, where I'd been living until I'd retired 10 days ago, and my home in Hawaii was rented out. If they turned me around at the border, I literally had no place to go. I could go to Penelope's on Lummi Island for a few days, I thought. She would take me in, give me some time to figure out my next move. The cars ahead of me were moving up a few feet at a time. Now I could see the border guard in the distance, bending down to peer into the car of the driver he was questioning. What would he ask me? What should I say to him? In a telephone consultation before I had left, my lawyer had cautioned me, whatever you do, don't tell the border guard you're coming to Canada for good, he'd warned. Why not? I'd wanted to know. Coming to Canada for good is the whole point. I hadn't been in the closet when I came out as a lesbian, and I didn't like the idea of being in the closet as an exile. Yes, he'd said, but that's all in the future. First, you have to get through 2 years of school. Then you can apply for permanent residency. Who knows what might happen between now and then? Right now, you're coming in as a student. That's the simple truth, and that's the story you need to tell. He'd convinced me. Then, like the good lawyer he was, he'd rehearsed me, playing suspicious border guard, asking me all the tough questions the guard might ask, so I wouldn't be caught by surprise and stammer out something inconsistent with the student story. Soon I would know whether I was as good a client as he was a lawyer. Behind me, Mary and Harrington were getting restless in their carriers. We'd been in line for a long time. I thought about taking them out into Peace Arch Park, one at a time on the leash, but I didn't dare risk it. I could picture one of them twisting out of the harness and bolting for the Peace Arch, heading across the border, an illegal alien cat making a run for freedom. No, they'd been on their good behavior, but I couldn't take the chance. They'd have to wait. Then the guard was waving me up. It was my turn. This was it. He bent down, peered around at the contents of the car, taking in the two cats in their carriers, the boxes of essentials, cooking gear, sleeping bag, lamp, folding chair. Destination? Victoria, I said. Purpose of your trip? I told him I was coming up to attend the University of Victoria as a full-time student. I have my letter of admission, but I have to get my student permit here at the border. I searched his face for a reaction, but there was none. No smirk, no slightly arched eyebrows. If he thought my story was fishy, he wasn't letting on. We chatted a while longer. He seemed friendly enough. I started to relax. And then it came. After the slightest of pauses, just a beat. So, he said casually, where's home? I said a prayer of thanks to the goddess of good lawyers, looked him straight in the eye, smiled a broad smile, and said in the most sincere manner I could muster, Hawaii! Immigration's inside. They'll take care of your paperwork, he said, pointing, and waved me through. We were in.
Thank you, Joy. Well, that is a very interesting story. And because I tried to do the same thing, I'm particularly intrigued by it. Thank you for sharing that with us. And maybe off camera, we'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to keep to the writing for our viewers. So maybe you could start first by telling us why you decided to write this story. We have many, many stories of our life, but you chose this one. What was it about that spoke to you? You wanted to write it.
Well, after I was up there for 2 years, they changed the law. And so I said, what do I do now? And my immigration lawyer said, just keep going to school, we'll figure it out. Well, it turned out that the University of Victoria had a 4-year creative writing program. So I got into that program. And one of the first classes I was able to take was called Long Creative Nonfiction. And in that class, we were to write chapters of a book that we would like to write. And so I started working on the book about going up to Canada as an exile. And after I finished school, came back to the United States and found the Hawaii Writers Guild, I eventually got back into the book, and now I'm on chapter 10. I intend to finish it.
Congratulations. Wow. So do you have a favorite genre? Because I know you write different types of things. What's your favorite type of writing? Is it this nonfiction or fiction, or do you have a favorite?
I have two favorites, playwriting and creative nonfiction, and specifically, normally personal essays, but in this case, a memoir.
So to me, playwriting is a very different type of writing than creative nonfiction. And I wonder how, because I've done both. I'm more like you with the creative nonfiction, but the playwriting is such a stretch for me. How did you get interested in that?
The first year we had to take an introductory course where we did all four: playwriting, poetry, nonfiction, and fiction. And then when I started taking the basic classes, I took the introductory class to playwriting. And it turned out that my teacher was one of the best women playwrights in the entire country of Canada. Wow. And I had done a little playwriting before, but she really inspired me. And I continued on with it partly because I admired her so much, partly because I always was a little inclined toward playwriting because of my own deficiencies as a writer. I can't describe things. I can't write fiction because my plots peter out in a couple of pages. And one of my on the plus side, when I read something in a book, I hear the words. So I'm already tuned into the sound of the words. So playwriting really intrigued me, and I really came to love it. But because I had many years ago also been a newspaper reporter before I'd become a lawyer, and had written a lot of stories that were not strict news stories, just feature stories, creative nonfiction came easily to me. Particularly something like a personal essay came very easily to me. So I went into those two. I had written poetry before, but I just absolutely could not get used to the idea of being graded for writing a poem. It just didn't seem right to me. And I couldn't write fiction. So that's what it came down to was playwriting and creative nonfiction.
Well, you bring up a really good point for people who are watching, which is to, it's nice to stretch ourselves and write something that maybe we're not comfortable with, but then there's also that recognition of, you know what, I like to write this type of thing. I like to write poetry. I like to write creative nonfiction. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to do something that's so challenging for me. I'm going to go with what I enjoy, and I feel like I do it pretty well. And that it sounds like you've been writing your whole life from being a reporter, and of course being an attorney. My God, there's so much writing to be done with that. Did you really delve into the creative part of your writing through this class or at a later stage in life?
Well, actually, I had been in writing groups. After I became an attorney, I just couldn't give writing up altogether. And at one point, I had gone back to upstate New York to a place called the Women's Writers Center. And I was in the very first year that they were in existence. There were 13 of us who would come together to write mainly about feminist stuff. And I wrote a lot of poetry there. We did oral readings, poetry, and we had some really famous, to me, guest teachers there. Marge Piercy came, Rita Mae Brown came for a week at a time. They weren't there the whole year, but it was really wonderful. So when I came back to California after that year and had to go back to work to support myself, I looked for a job as an attorney, but I was determined to keep writing in my life. And so from then on, I was always in some sort of writing group mostly with other women.
Well, I want to thank you, Joy, for joining the show today, being my guest, and for sharing something, deeply personal and also inspiring those who are watching to say, hey, you can go to college, you can go take courses at any age and learn some new skills, especially right now with this lockdown that we're all kind of limited to what we can do. I know I'm taking a few classes online, that there's always more for us to learn. So thank you very much. Thanks for participating today. And I want to remind viewers that if you want to know more about the Hawaii Writers Guild, you can go to the website, hawaiiwritersguild.com. And there's also a Facebook page of Hawaii Writers Guild. So until next time, aloha, everyone.